So I thought tonight I'd take on the subject of right and wrong. And what could be controversial about that? Last week we explored the neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and anthropology of being fully human, and I'm going to try to extend this to really talk about what these books have told us about that concept as well. And then extend the work into the concepts of right and wrong. Under the proviso that my daughter has forbidden me for speaking any foreign languages for good reasons, because I can butcher my own name, I thought we would start with a concept that all you folks who actually spend time in theology know about, the hamartia, is that the correct way to say it? Or the verb form hamartine. And as I read about this really came from Aristotle and the concept of the tragic flaw from their work. And so as you went down this pathway, you got on the wrong pathway and it ended up coming out to be a tragedy. And so that actually has come about and I think makes a lot of sense for me as a scientist, and we're going to talk about why. Now, in the Christian theology, it goes back to this of missing the mark. When you try to do something and you miss the mark, to fall short of an objective. And so one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is studies on humanism that show that this is innate to us. So what we're trying to do is kind of pull this together. And this goes back to the book I introduced last week, Tomasello's Becoming Human. Because again, this guy worked at the Max Planck Institute for 20 years. He studied bonobos, chimps, and children. And the book is all about going through and studying in detail in different situations what goes on and what sort of behaviors. And so I'm going to circle back and go a little bit deeper into this book than I did last week. So one of the things we talked about is one of the things that makes us distinctly human. There are about 8 traits that he's identified. And somewhere about 100,000, somewhere between 400,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago, these traits emerged. And one of the things that it talks about is it really kind of violates Darwinism. It's not about survival of the fittest. It's not natural selection. Something happened that had, and the theory is that there were things in the brain that developed that now had new uses that were unanticipated. Now, how many have either read the book or seen the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey? So as I read this book, the thing I thought about was the monolith and the chimp throwing the bone up in the air. Something happened to create this difference. If we go back to our last common ancestor, somewhere in the 6 to 4 million years ago, the paths have diverged. And it turns out that, as we talked a little bit last week, there's things, chimps, no matter how much training, they're intelligent, but they can't see the world differently than they see it. On the other hand, and I think this is fairly conclusive in how we're born, he says all of this stuff is innate and then needs to be developed. And so the first is social cognition, and it's objective and subjective reasoning. Objective is easy for chimps to do. You put food out, I'm going to grab it, I'm going to eat it. The subjective is thinking, if I set food out, maybe Don's hungry and would like to share it. That doesn't happen with. It's also the important thing, if we think about hamartia, is false beliefs. Because I'm going to pull after this to talk about the neuroscience, how our brain actually works. Because what happens is when things don't feel right, it's because they're missing the mark. In our construct, in our long-term memory structures, we go, wait a minute, this is not right. This isn't what I was intending to do. Communication, understanding conventions and normative speech. So one of the things that has made a huge difference is our ability to speak and communicate effectively. And that creates the vocabulary. So one of the things is that my grandchildren, Emily, their mother is the librarian, they had between 4 and 6 million words said to them by the time they're 5. Cultural learning, instructed learning from generic information. So what this really talks about is until you're about 3 years of age, you actually respond to adults, not children, not your cohort. So this is the concept of parallel play, but they all respond to adults. And that instructed learning of generic information gets transmitted. And this goes back to what I think becomes important in our discussion of right and wrong and making it universal. There's going to be a cultural component. There's going to be a learned behavior that we're going to talk about that informs our right and wrong decisions. But I'm also going to say that there are universal truths in right and wrong. Collaboration, joint commitment, the ability to work together and form teams becomes important. The idea of fairness and reciprocity, this in particular becomes important. This gets back to what you were talking about, be kind. That's about fairness and reciprocity. I understand what your wants and needs are. This is the golden rule. This is doing what Jesus would do. That is based on this concept of growing out fairness and reciprocity. And then to the other side, the social norms and enforcing the norms and respecting possession. So at some point, there needs to be a societal right and wrong. There needs to be some construct and some consequences from going outside that construct. And then one of the things that maybe UCC is not good at, but some other Abrahamic faiths are really good at, is the concept of guilt. And that plays an important role as well. That's that feedback loop that says, I'm doing something wrong. I feel guilty for doing this. This causes me to want to change my behavior, to get back in alignment with hitting the mark. So, moral identity is uniquely human. There's no other species, even though we have common ancestry, that have moral identity. And Tomasello describes that as me concerns, the idea of survive and thrive. And that's not just unique. Chimps are really good at the survive and thrive side, especially if you're the alpha male or alpha female. The me concerns, the you concerns, sympathy and helping others. That's uniquely human and becomes important. Equality, concerns of self and others that deserve equality. This is an inborn characteristic. This is not necessarily learned, but culturally adopted to it, as we'll talk about. So as we look at this, how many have worked with 3, 4, 5-year-olds who use the following phrase, that's not fair? So that comes across because that's a concept that they understand. We concerns, the need to conform to the group. And we're going to talk a little bit when I get to Jonathan Haidt's work about how that really comes into play, where there's different values for the we concerns. The need to conform to the group. So there is a certain sense of this is the group and I need to conform to the external standards. So let's look at some specific examples from this. By 6 months of age, children react to a hostile environment or a warm, nurturing environment. Where you grow up, how you're parenting and exposed, has a lot to do with it. When you talk to child psychiatrists, when you talk to sports psychologists, those first 5 years lay the foundation for how they view their world, what's right and wrong. And we had discussions about trafficking earlier and human trafficking and how those people have grown up in an abnormal environment and don't know any different. This starts then. They actually understand. You put a 6-month-old into a hostile environment and they will respond and start crying. You're putting them in a warm, nurturing environment, they will respond accordingly. By age 3, they start to feel guilt and harming others. Or as my soon-to-be 3-year-old goes, after he tackles his brother going, sorry. By age 6, they exhibit reciprocity and mutual respect. And this is really the age, and this is why kindergarten, they make such leaps, is because their brain is ready to become norming among their age group rather than always looking up towards an adult. And culturally specific adoption begins around age and then quickly develops all the way through. So a child growing up in India will have different values than someone growing up in Omaha. Someone coming to this church will have different cultural values than someone growing up in an evangelical church. Now, how many of you had a chance at all to read The Righteous Mind? I've read it before. This is a wonderful book that, to me, was important as I was going into the 2016 election to try to understand, and I think is even more important now in our world. Next week, I'm going to talk about consciousness and AI, and I'll get a little bit into some of what is happening there. But what happens is Jonathan Haidt is a cognitive psychologist who has done a lot of research, spent a lot of time in other cultures to try to understand, and basically has come up with a concept that there are 6 foundations for moral belief. So there's the care concept, the fairness concept, the liberty concept. And what happens, and what I think you guys need to think about as we do this, is different individuals will weigh these differently. So there is a group called libertarians. And you would think, by definition, they're going to value liberty over other concepts. And at a certain point, I realize you are all probably big Madden NFL video game players. But there's this ability to go in and set players different skills and how fast they are, how hard they hit, et cetera, et cetera. This is really kind of the construct that I would think about with this, which is, as a human being, you have a certain amount of capacity for care, fairness, liberty. Loyalty becomes important. Authority becomes important. One of the things we'll talk about is Chinese society, from what I've been able to read, has a different construct, at least through the late 90s, of I don't want my neighbors to talk about me. Shame is very important in that sort of culture. Normative behavior becomes very important. I don't want to stand out. I want to be part of that. This is where the United States, and we'll talk a little bit, and Haidt talks about that. There are some of us who are kind of anti-authoritarian by nature. I won't mention anybody, but one of them's kind of standing in front of you. And then sanctity, and the idea of religion and God becomes an important thing. So those are the domains, and as he explains, and this book does a really nice job, there's an opposite side. I didn't really want to get into the opposite side, but I think we can all imagine If you don't value those things, what happens? So if you're an anarchist, authority, you throw that out and you go, good luck with that. But these are the values that different people drive. And what he is saying is, in many cases, both culturally and your team, your group, your identity, your family, helps form how much you value the care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity going through and that. And so one of the concepts, which I thought was a way to exhibit this, was really the discussion of what he described as weird people. Weird people are Western, educated, rich, industrial democracies. I think this church would be an example of populated with weird people. The United States and Europe, much more. Individual-centric, equality and equity-centric. These are very important values as we go through this. But one of the things he said really changed is when he did work in India, and his ideas of what was right and wrong, what was fair, etc., was turned on its head because these people valued those 6 characteristics in a different order and a different level. So there are groups that prize order over equality. And when you look at societies, if you don't have order, if you don't have basic services, you can't really advance. Now, we kind of take order as pretty much a given, and other places can't. The concept, and so if we look at Japan, for instance, elders should be honored and subordinates protected. One of the interesting things is I probably work in the most diverse setting of any place in Nebraska working at the Med Center, because we have health care workers from all over the world. And with that, you get, if you actually listen to them, they have a certain way. And for instance, it's really hard for me. A number of my fellows are from India, and their deference to me, not sitting down till I sit down, not going through a door till I go through the door, is inbred. And they have this concept. Being a professor gives deference. And if again, that can lead to abuse of those things, but it's just a different societal. I think the important thing that sometimes we forget then is subordinates are protected. That sort of society, I'm not going to try to justify the caste system. I have a fellow who is explaining his 4 names, and one of those names is his caste. And there's a book by Verghese, Something of Water. It is a wonderful book to talk about South India and the culture that surrounds that. And so we just need to understand that. Now, one of the things he gets into is people's belief comes more through intuition than rational thought, and we're righteous. And I don't know if any of you have done this, but occasionally my wife has asked me to do things that I forgot to do. And rather than just fess up and admit it and say those magic words of a good marriage, I was wrong, I will create a backstory to help cover this. And that comes from our natural self. And last week, we talked a little bit about the chimp and that. So we have some righteousness. And what happens is when we're exposed to a situation, we make an immediate decision. And then what happens is our brain starts to try to rationalize, why did we come up with that decision? So you're driving in a car. Someone cuts you off. You create a construct. Now, oftentimes you don't really think about what leads to that. I had an interesting example that, again, once you sat back and reflected. So there was an RV from Iowa that just kept parking in the wrong place on the campus. And I wanted to be there. And didn't they know that they weren't the only people? Now, it turns out that one of their siblings, family members, had a lung transplant, and that's where they were staying. Now, once you understand that backstory, they're staying in the RV not because they can afford the fancy hotels to do this. This is what they need to do. Once you get that backstory, once you understand, once you reflect upon it, it changes your precepts. And so one of the things that he talks about is, and I didn't put in a lot of work except for one book about Sustain and Thaler and the concepts of the perfect econ, the perfect thinking, rational person. But we're not. We have all sorts of biases, as I talked about at the beginning with Daniel Kahneman. And what Haidt describes as chimpanzees, the selfish side, and the bees. Now, he has an 80-20 ratio. I think, honestly, we're probably a little closer to 50-50. I think we want to be norms. One of my favorite books is a book called Dignity, and it's by a photojournalist. And this is a gentleman out of New York who went to the wrong parts of town in New York City to take pictures. And during that time, he'd actually sit down and start getting to know these people. And what he realized is, even though they may have different values, they all needed some measure of dignity. They needed to have that. Even if you're homeless, there's a code, there's rules that go with that. And yes, they're a drug addict. Yes, they'll take and steal from you, but there's a code of what's right and wrong. And so I think that there's a lot more bee behavior out there. We just have to understand what makes them bees. One of the things I thought was kind of an important concept, and I didn't have the word for it, but parochial altruism. The idea that my family is first is pretty innate. It's true in the chimps, it's true in us. And as we look at this gets back a little bit to the biblical side of my neighbors. And you can start seeing a lot of what Don talked about when you look at human nature and why Jesus said and why the Bible teaches those things about love your neighbor, because they understand the family pod. And now you have to extend a little bit beyond that. And it's the core of tribalism. Now, again, we all go, well, tribalism's bad, but we are all part of this tribe, the group that's coming here tonight. Those are things that draw us together. And what Jonathan Haidt talks about is you need orthodoxy and orthopraxy to make that happen. So there is common words that we use, whether it's the Lord's Prayer, whether it's we are an open and affirming family of faith. That's orthodoxy. And saying it at every church service is orthopraxy, and it's building that. And that's innately human. That goes back to what was talked about in terms of pro-sociality. That's the way you build this narrative. So when you look at the Olympics when they were in Beijing, and they had 10,000 people drumming in unison, that is something that starts very early, because that sort of tribalism, that sort of unity comes in place. Now, where to me it becomes an issue is we first have to just appreciate that. We have to appreciate what draws us together. Then the orthodoxy and orthopraxy need to follow. We need that. We need that structure. I think one of the challenges right now is for many people, they don't have anything to hold on to. They don't have any beliefs that they can go, I'm good with this. This is why I wanted to do this, because I see so many people who don't have a rope to hold on to kind of say, this is right, this is wrong. I'm going to hold on to this, and I'm okay with that. Because we don't do well in chaos. We don't do well when there is no structure, no orthodoxy, no orthopraxy. And so we need the things because we cannot continuously be challenged every thought, every decision. But it leads to tribal identity. And as we know, and this to our book, The Dawn of Everything, tribalism is very important and universal. And tribalism exists as long as there's human history. You know, one of the things we talked about last time is the concept of original sin. And as I read more about that, there's all sorts of different theories of original sin. You know, are you born pure and then sin comes into your life, or are you born in sin and is it existential? For me, it's existential. It is our chimp side that comes out, and it's inborn of who we are. It's that self. And what we have to learn and what we have to reinforce are the other components. But we have to understand the tribal nature of that. Now, one of the things, and this is something I hope we can discuss a little bit, his comment is, we acquire morality like we acquire food preferences. Culture and acquired tastes. So, if you grow up eating certain foods, you're going to more likely like them. For me, it's peanut butter. I've had a long and loving career with peanut butter. But there's other things. And so my daughter only started off eating white food, rice, chicken, potatoes. Now, she's growing because one of the things is you can acquire tastes. You can learn different concepts of right and wrong. But the culture tends to hold on. Another metaphor that Jonathan Haidt uses is the elephant and the rider. And that as you learn things, as you build things, it's like the elephant. It's going on its pathway. And to change an elephant's direction when they're moving pretty fast, it's not going to be agile. So as you look at it, now, one of the things, and I put an asterisk up there by intuition, because I don't think that's right. And again, I'm very careful when I'm disagreeing with Daniel Kahneman, who got a Nobel Prize, and Jonathan Haidt, going, you know, you guys, you may be Nobel Prize winners, but I'm right and you're wrong. But what I've read from the neurosurgical side, or the neuroscience side of things, is it's not intuition that we build. It's not intuition we react to. It's our long-term memory. And that's what I talked about in terms of Garry Kasparov and the chess players who can look at a board and go, I know what I do next, and see things in very deep ways. It's your ability to do anything at a high level and gain expertise. It is Lionel Messi kicking a soccer ball. That's expertise, and that's built into his brain. And he doesn't have to think about that when he's running up to a ball. He doesn't go, right foot or left foot. He sees everything and it's all automatic. That's what I think they're calling as intuition. That's what Jonathan Haidt's talking about in terms of intuition goes before thoughtfulness. And what happens with righteousness is kind of when our mental model, our long-term memory doesn't line up either with our own beliefs or the situation we're seeing or somebody else's beliefs. And what he wants to do is really have that concept that we need to think about that and pull back and reflect upon it. Now, if we remember, who remembers what this is? Chicken with 60 cloves or 40 cloves of garlic. This is the ongoing battle in the Windle household. Yep. So I think it's important to bring back the concept of facts, honesty, and truth. So what we see now is, as human beings, we talked about the fact that we actually don't see the world as it exists. We see the world as a reflection, and it comes into our model. So as I look at this room, I have billions of pixels of light coming in and all this stuff. But what I'm laying down is one snapshot every 30th of a second. And then movement changes that, and my perspective changes. I'm not capturing 8 billion bits every millisecond or 17 milliseconds. So as we do this, we're stuck with what do we actually see in the world? What's our long-term memory say is right and wrong in our construct? So facts are facts. That's the legal system is based on that because, as we talked about, because honesty and truth are too hard to do. So when you're an attorney, you're really lining up your facts to create a narrative versus the other person's narrative. And the idea is that the best narrative is the closest to the truth. Honesty, there's a thing called the Rashomon effect, which is how you view a situation can be different. And the Rashomon effect is a little bit like that RV that was parked across where I wanted to park every day. I saw it in a certain direction. I saw it as someone who was trying to just get off easy and not park where they were supposed to and interfering with my ability to park where I wanted to. When I looked at it from a different perspective, I saw this in a completely different light. And I saw human beings who were just trying to get their family member healthy and home. And that changes your perspective. They didn't do it by choice. They did it because this is what was necessary. So as we look at this, I want that concept of facts. Those are objective measures. Those are things you can find. Honesty is how we see things and interact. And then, as we talked about in the original story, we both agree that we had chicken with 40 cloves of garlic and it was incredibly good. We honestly believe there are two cities about 200 kilometers apart. There is a truth. Unfortunately, at this point, the truth will never be ascertained because I don't think we can find the taxi driver to drop us back at the potential places to go. You know, I don't see us going to Paris going, drop us at the best chicken with 40 cloves of garlic place in Paris. Nah, this wasn't the place. Let's go to Lyon and see where they drop us off. But that's important. So when I think about God and I think about the world, and as we do this, I think there are truths. And the wonderful thing in my mind is that those truths are getting revealed to us. Now, before we get there, I want to come back and talk about Todd Rose. He kind of amplifies on what Jonathan Haidt talked about dogma and paternalism. So if we remember what he's talking about in this book, and I think this is a wonderful book, humans by our nature need a social structure and a common sense of beliefs. So we've seen this with Becoming Human with Tomasello, we've seen it with Jonathan Haidt, we see it with Todd Rose. In religion, this leads to the creation of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. I hope I've been able to convince people of that is a truth. We are susceptible to groupthink. So as we get in here, I look at who's agreeing with me and who's not. And I don't want to get on the wrong side. I don't want to have an argument today. So I'm going to believe. And one of the things that this book talked about was a community in New England of people of Puritan descent. What are they called? Congregationalists? And so, who knows why you should not play with face cards in your deck? Has anybody ever heard that? So, they could not play with face deck, cards in the face decks, because they're an idol. So, they'd have all these games, none of them involved face cards. And they're going, you know, if we play with face cards, if we play this game, our neighbors are going to talk about us. And we're going to. And so for years, there were all these groups that refused to do this. And then Todd comes into this community and talks to the minister. And he goes, no, this is silly. This isn't ideal. You know, we're at this point nearing the 21st century. And once the minister said, oh, it's okay to play with face cards, everybody goes, oh, good, we thought that all along. And that's the origin of this collective illusion. You have certain beliefs, and it doesn't hit home. It doesn't seem right. But everybody else is believing it, so it must be. And this gets back to, I hope, the concept of MRT. In your brain, you look at this and you go, things are not quite aligned. I think as we look at this, that's one of the things that I think, as I come kind of to the conclusions here tonight, I want to bring home. Now, the other thing I do want to come back to, because one of the things I talk about in medicine and in treatment is every decision I make has intended and unintended consequences. So actions always have intended and unintended consequences. So when we looked at this, we talked about prosociality, we talked about structure. The problem that Rose talks about is paternalism, and it's the action that limits a person or group's autonomy and is intended to promote their own good. You're taking this medicine for your own good. I'm doing this procedure for your good. So medicine is really pretty paternalistic. I'm doing this for your good. That takes a certain measure of trust on your hand. So I don't want to say that all paternalism is bad, but it needs to be mindful, and you need to be able to ask the question, is there taking advantage of me? Am I able to participate? That's, to me, the wonderful thing about the UCC structure with discernment. Each of us are asked to discern on our own what the right answer is. And that helps break down that concept of paternalism just for paternalism's sake. Now, I like paternalism because I happen to be a white male of a certain age. And I've grown up in a world where paternalism, male-centered world has existed. But as we talked about before, it just didn't feel right to a lot of us. So for me, the big aha moment came, now I was the youngest of 4 children, I was 12 or 13 at the time, was Thanksgiving in the early 60s. How did that work? Well, Mom and the girls made everything. Then dinner table was set. Everybody sat down. After dinner, what happened? Mom and the girls picked up all the dishes and took it away. Well, since I had a sister who in 1963 had an IUD necklace, we were in a little more disruptive situation in our household. And I, even though I grew up Missouri Synod Lutheran, I grew up in a very open discussion era. And we decided at that time that the women should sit after Thanksgiving dinner. And so for the past 55 years, the men have been responsible for doing the dishes and cleaning up afterwards. That changes our concept. So as we go about that, I think it's important to think about those ways. And so now I want to start moving towards what I think are the positive sides of what I've been trying to present. So hate's solution to the righteous mind: develop sympathetic relations with others. And if anything expresses the tri-faith initiative, it ought to be this. And this may be a very important time to have that discussion, is to think about it from other people's perspective and try to understand their position. Create time and space to contemplate and reflect. As we talked about, a lot of our long-term memory stuff is that. But we need time to grow, to build new models. We need time to sit back and reflect upon that. And if there were one goal from this series of lectures for me, is to have you guys contemplate and reflect back and give me feedback with that. And then one of the things he argues, and I'm going to bring it up next week when we talk about AI and that, is to break up ideological segregation. If we all agree with each other and we're a small group and we become self-affirming, we move further and further away from the world. The more we integrate and get to know people who are different, the broader our perspectives and understanding. Now, the anecdote for paternalism, Susteen and Thaler, again, I'm not disagreeing with this Nobel Prize winner. This is another wonderful book. It's called Nudge. And it's a way of trying to do right without hitting people over the head. And it turns out we're all kind of lazy. So if you make it easy to do the right thing, if you nudge people in the right direction, you can make change. Now, for us, where this becomes important, how many of you have donor cards that if you're involved in an accident, you want your organs donated? How is that done? It is an opt-out feature, not an opt-in. When they had it as an opt-in feature, less than 10% of people checked the box. When they made people go, no, I really don't, I want to opt out, about 5% of people actually opt out. That's what they're talking about in Nudge, is making it easy to do the right thing. And so as we look at this, as we talk about this, I think you can use Nudge and use discernment to get at that. So where are we now? So we started with this slide, is God dead? We talked about the fact that belief in God is at an all-time low and going down in a rapid pace. None of these slides do we go from 64% up to 80%. So as we come through this, what I posited was there's kind of three mechanisms why this is happening. The first, articulated by Dr. Spong, is that the fundamentalists who believe in the inerrant word of the Bible are driving people away from God because it's too simplistic a view for me. I'm going to suggest, however, for the tri-faith, we need to forget about the evangelicals. We have to worry about the 50% of people who no longer believe in God. So this is Richard Dawkins. He is an aggressive atheist. He is pushing that there is no God, and if you believe in God, you're a bad person. And as I may have talked about with Steven Pinker, also an atheist, but a much more rational person, when Francis Collins got director of the NIH, Pinker was adamant that this was going to destroy science in America. Only later did he realize that rational human beings and scientists can believe in God. And one of the things that was interesting to me among physicists, about 40% of physicists believe in God in the 1920s. In the 2020s, about 40% of physicists believe in God. So they were saying that there really has not been that diminution. But that message gets out. And then the other thing we talked about is the postmodernism and the concept there is no right and there is no wrong. Everything is relativistic. Everything is towards your gain. And if you take this, then my concern is that you don't have anything to hold on to. So I tried to make the point that humans are different from chimps. And when we talk about this concept, to me what we have to do is exploit what we've been given in terms of growing our humanism and building this. One of the concepts that's out there is the concept of secular humanism. Have people heard about that? So secular humanism, from my perspective, is a wonderful concept. The difficulty with secular humanism, I believe, is it lacks the orthodoxy and orthopraxy to be successful. So you don't have a structure for moving things forward. I don't think there's a lot of difference between my beliefs and those who would claim themselves to be secular humanists. There is common human nature. I would also want to make the point, we've got to be very careful when we add that paternalistic statement of this is a Western belief. Because in all of my research, whether it's the dawn of everything, when it's Tomasello's Becoming Human, none of that is based on Western thought. What I like about this, if you look at Japanese culture, when you look at Chinese, when you look at in the Ukraine establishing 10,000 years ago, all of them have the same sort of constructs of how we should behave and how we should be. So as we look at this, as I said, this is what strikes me. And so for me, original sin is when we allow our chimp side to rule the roost. And we have to actively build out that long-term memory that's different. So, as I came into this, I believe in science, and I refuse to abandon science to support my beliefs. The fundamentals of science is, this is the knowledge I have, but I may be wrong and we may be growing. So I like Steven Pinker and Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, and Humanism in Progress. This is a very optimistic book, and I'd recommend that to you because it gets away towards your point. It goes far beyond the sound bites and the quick grabbing. And I'm a big fan of the Francis Collins and the science that comes from that. I mean, Francis Collins grew up an atheist, and when he went into medicine, it didn't reach truth. It didn't hit the arrow. It didn't hit the target. And he goes, something's wrong with my life because I'm just as smart as I've been, but I don't have center. And he found religion as the way to center. And he's very much in that. He was in charge of the Human Genome Project. So what happens is they go, oh, you're part of that group that believes the Earth is 4,632 years old. Is that still, or are we 433 years old now? I can't. So I'm not going to give up on the concepts. But I also believe in a living God. I think religion gets in trouble when it fixes God's word at a point in time. Because what happens is knowledge grows and changes. And to read the Bible in 2023, to read those texts without an understanding of what the words meant and the meaning doesn't get the full story. You have to understand it in a historical concept and use all the tools we have for historians and anthropologists to go, ah, this now makes sense for what they're saying. To me, the most amazing thing, so I'm a big Karen Armstrong fan. If you want to have 726 pages of why you should believe in God, I would talk to this. It is not an easy read, but it's a well-informed read. Francis Collins I've talked about. And so you can do the greatest science. And finally, I'm going to end up with Albert Einstein again. I believe in the God of Spinoza. I believe there's things that are innate in the world. We are in an ordered universe that makes sense. And to me in medicine, the most amazing thing is we're discovering new things every day. We're learning new things every day. Now, the universe hasn't changed, but it's being revealed to us, and that is incredible. You know, Francis Collins talks about we have to believe in knowledge, and we have to believe in the growth in knowledge. And so to me, that's the optimistic thing. If we keep working towards truth, now back to what happened in Gaza, there is a truth. There is absolutely a truth whether this was a rocket misfiring or a bomb dropped from an airplane. There is a truth. Right now, there are honest people disagreeing, and they're taking facts to apply it one way or another. My personal belief is overall, if we all work towards the truth, which is aspirational, the world will be a better place. And I think that's what we heard when we first asked the question about right and wrong. So that's what I have for tonight. Next week, I want to try to tie this back together with artificial intelligence and consciousness, bringing out the classic concept of yin and yang, bringing back that idea, and you're going to hear about objective and subjective stuff. I hope that's okay. What we learned tonight is that humans have both objective and subjective. Logos and mythos. I think this has been greatly misunderstood. And for scientists, we've relied too much on logos without reflecting on mythos. And clearly, if we're going to have intuition, if we're going to build more and more complex models, we need to understand the mysticism that goes into that. Because I think you can have both mathematics and metaphors as being truths. So that's what I have for tonight. Parting shots? If not, thank you very much. I'll look forward to seeing you next week.